The morning her SUV stopped across the mouth of my runway, Dana Whitlock rolled down her window and told me a man ought to know when it was time to step aside for progress. Behind her, roof lines had already climbed toward both ends of the strip my family had flown from for 30 years. She said the board had decided my runway no longer fit the character of the community. I didn't argue with her. I just watched the sedan with the federal plate turn in through my gate, and I watched the smile slide off her face like water off a wing. If you enjoy stories where a homeowners association thinks it holds the power and gets undone by its own paperwork, subscribe and stay to the end. My name is Darius Hale. I'm 52 years old, and I own 73 acres of red dirt and bahia grass with a 3,100-foot strip of asphalt running north to south down the middle of it. People call it Hale Field, and the name was on a county plat before I ever learned to drive. My father bought the land in the late 1960s, back when this whole stretch of the county was cattle, hay, and one gas station that closed at dusk. He cut the first runway himself with a borrowed grader and a level he set on the hood of his truck, and he flew a tired old high-wing airplane out of here for 20 years before he handed me the keys and the deed and the folder of documents that mattered more than either. I spent 26 years as an aircraft maintenance technician, most of it on turbine equipment, the last stretch running my own small repair shop about 9 miles from my front gate. That work taught me two things that ended up saving me. The first was that airplanes don't care how confident you are. They care whether the numbers are right. The second was that every serious thing in aviation exists twice, once in the world and once on paper, and the paper version is the one that survives an argument. So when I took over this property, I didn't just mow it and fly it. I paved it properly, I lit the ends, I registered it, and I made sure every agency that could ever have an opinion about it had a file with my name in it. Hale Field is a private-use airfield, which is a specific thing and not a vague one. It isn't a commercial airport, there's no control tower, no terminal, no scheduled traffic, and nobody lands here without my permission. What it is, legally, is a registered landing facility that appears in aeronautical records, that has published coordinates, an assigned identifier, and a documented runway orientation. I use it for my own airplane, for post-maintenance test flights on equipment out of my shop, and for the occasional trip when a customer 3 states away needs a part and a set of hands the same day. In a normal year, I might make 400 takeoffs and landings off that strip, which is quiet by airport standards and constant by neighborhood standards. The part almost nobody bothered to learn is what happened in 1988, when my father worked with the county on the parcels surrounding us. Because the strip was already here and already active, the county recorded an aviation easement across the adjoining land, and it also recorded height and use restrictions tied to the approach and departure paths on both ends. An aviation easement is a plain, boring instrument. It says the owner of that neighboring land accepts that aircraft will pass over it at low altitude, gives up the right to complain about the noise and the shadow, and agrees not to build anything that intrudes into the airspace an airplane needs. It runs with the land, not with the person, which means it binds whoever buys that dirt next, forever, whether they read it or not. For about 11 years after Silver Pines went in, none of this mattered to anybody. The first phase of the subdivision was 40-some houses set well back from my property line, and most of the people who bought them thought the airplane was interesting. Kids waved from their yards. A retired mail carrier named Ellis used to bring his grandson to the fence on Saturday mornings to watch me run the engine up. I flew neighborly, kept my patterns tight, avoided early departures on weekends, and in 11 years I got exactly 2 complaints, both from the same man, both about a Saturday afternoon flight, both resolved with a handshake and a jar of honey from my own hives. That was the whole history of conflict at Hale Field until the year Dana Whitlock was elected president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. I met her in April, on a Tuesday, in my own hangar. She came in without knocking, wearing a cream jacket that cost more than my mower, holding a clipboard she never once wrote on. She looked past me at the airplane, at the oil-stained concrete, at the shelf of hand tools my father had labeled in grease pencil, and she smiled the way people smile at a museum exhibit they find slightly sad. She said she'd expected the owner of a place like this to be somebody different, and she let the sentence sit there unfinished so I could fill in the ending myself. I didn't fill it in. I told her my name, offered her coffee, and watched her decide she was already finished with me. She wanted to talk about noise, she said, though she hadn't come with a single complaint in hand. She wanted to talk about property values, and about the direction the community was heading, and about how her board had a mandate to protect the investment of every family behind that gate. She used the word community 11 times in 9 minutes. When I told her the airfield was registered, active, and older than the subdivision, she nodded the way you nod at a child explaining a rule to a game they invented. Then she said something I wrote down that night because I knew I'd want it later, that men my age often confused owning land with having a say in what a community becomes. 4 months later, I was out at the south end doing a walk of the runway surface, checking for frost heave and loose seal, when I noticed something in the grass beyond my fence line. Survey stakes. A neat row of them, orange flagging tied to each one, marching straight through the field on the far side of my approach end. Somebody had been standing in that pasture with a total station, shooting angles, laying out lots. I stood there with a can of crack sealer in my hand and did the math on where the center line of my runway pointed. And I understood that whoever set those stakes had put a building envelope directly under the place my landing gear crossed at 40 feet. The notice came the following week, a glossy trifold in every mailbox in the area including mine, announcing the Silver Pines expansion. 62 new homes in 2 phases, a new entry monument, a landscaped boulevard, an amenity green. Dana's photograph was on the back, arms folded, standing in front of the gate with the confidence of someone opening a stadium. Inside was a color site plan, and on that site plan my 73 acres appeared as a soft green rectangle with a single label across it. Open agricultural tract. There was no runway drawn on it. There was no strip of asphalt, no hangar, no approach corridor, no easement hatching, nothing at all to suggest that a registered landing facility sat where the map showed hay. I brought that trifold to the community information meeting they held in the clubhouse, and I waded through 40 minutes of talk about paint palettes and mailbox standards before I raised my hand. I asked, plainly, what had happened to the runway on the plan. Dana looked at me across a room of folding chairs and said that nobody builds an entire community around one man's hobby. I said it wasn't a hobby, it was a registered airfield with an identifier, and I offered her the file number out loud, twice, slowly, so the people writing things down could get it. She said the expansion had been engineered by professionals and reviewed by the county, and then she moved to the next question before I finished my sentence. She found me in the parking lot afterward. That's where she said the honest part, the part she wouldn't say into a microphone. She told me Silver Pines' values would jump the day that ugly patch of asphalt finally got developed like everything else out here, that the market had already priced in my leaving, and that everyone would be better off once I stopped pretending the 1970s were coming back. Then she asked what number would make me go away. I told her the land wasn't for sale, and she laughed and said everything is for sale. Some people just need help understanding their own timeline. What came next arrived in envelopes. The first was a noise complaint, forwarded from the association, describing my aircraft as a persistent disturbance. Then a request that I voluntarily limit flight operations to between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, weekdays only. Then, a letter asserting that my operations were adversely affecting property values within the association and inviting me to a hearing before the architectural committee. Then a demand that I bring my hangar into compliance with Silver Pine's exterior standards, including approved siding colors, because a metal building was inconsistent with the visual character of the neighborhood. Then, in November, an actual invoice, a $200 fine for an unapproved structure, mailed to a man whose land had never been part of their association for one single day. I paid nothing, and I answered everything. Every letter got a written reply, dated, with the file number, the plat reference, the recorded easement, and a single sentence stating that my property was not subject to the association. I sent them by certified mail. I kept the green cards in a binder with tabs. I photographed the survey stakes on the 11th of each month from the same 3 positions so the progression would be undeniable. And every time Dana spoke to me in front of her board members like I was a groundskeeper she'd hired and was disappointed in, I went home and wrote down the date, the words, and who else was standing there. In March, the excavators arrived. They came in on lowboys before 6 in the morning, 4 of them, and by noon they had ripped a haul road through the pasture at my south end. Within 9 days there were water lines in the ground. Within 3 weeks the first foundations went in, and I stood at my fence with a hand level and a tape, and understood that the closest slab was less than 300 feet from the end of my pavement, sitting almost exactly under the center line extended. Then the framers came, and the walls went up, and they weren't the single-story ranch houses of the original phase. They were 2-story homes with steep roofs and stone chimneys, and every one of them climbed straight into the air I needed. The construction didn't stop at houses either, and, honestly, the houses weren't even the worst of it. Dana had put a decorative boulevard down the new spine road with 28-foot ornamental light standards. She'd specified a masonry perimeter wall along the north edge of the expansion, which sat on the very ground the easement was supposed to keep clear. And she had planted trees, dozens of them, live oaks and cypress in a double row, the kind that reach 50 feet and don't ask permission. Somebody looking at a rendering would call it beautiful. I looked at it and saw a wall of obstructions rising into a departure path, growing taller every year, on land that had been legally restricted from exactly that since before she owned a driver's license. I wrote the county. I did it properly, with a cover letter, exhibits, the plat, the recorded easement, my registration, and photographs with dates and coordinates. 6 weeks later, I got a response that made my stomach drop, 2 paragraphs long, telling me that the referenced projects had been reviewed and permitted, that permits had been issued in accordance with applicable zoning, and that private disputes between adjoining owners were outside the department's scope. Permitted. That was the word that kept me up. Somewhere in a building 9 miles from my hangar, someone had looked at plans for houses under an active runway and stamped them. And the only way that happens is if the plan said something untrue. Dana knew before I did. She came out on a Thursday with 2 board members trailing her, parked on my gravel, and stood in front of my hangar with the county letter printed out in her hand. She read the word permitted out loud like a verdict. She said the debate was over, that the county had spoken, that the community had moved forward, and that I should be grateful anyone was still willing to make me an offer. Then she made it. Sign a covenant permanently closing Hale Field, and the development partnership would buy 18 acres off my south end for a number that was roughly 40% of what that dirt was worth with the strip intact. I told her no. I didn't raise my voice and I didn't explain, because explaining to her had never once produced anything, and she wasn't there to be persuaded. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said the sentence that finally told me the whole plan. She said, "Fine, then I could sit right here and watch the houses close in around me 1 street at a time until there was no legal way left to take off, and she'd be happy to let the market do what I refused to do myself. She thought that was a threat. It was actually a confession, and I asked her to repeat it in front of her own board members, and she did. So I hired a surveyor, a woman named Marguerite Boyd, who'd been shooting boundaries in this county for 30 years and had no interest in anybody's feelings. I paid her to do 3 things: locate my true property lines, plot the recorded aviation easement in its exact position, and establish the height and location of every new structure relative to my runway ends and center line. It took her 9 days and cost me $4,200, and when she brought me the drawings, she spread them on my workbench and went quiet for a while before she said anything at all. Then she pointed at the masonry wall and at 2 of the light standards and at 11 framed houses, and she told me they were sitting inside a restricted area that should have triggered review before a permit ever printed. Then she asked me a question that changed the whole thing. She turned around, leaned back against the bench, and said, "Darius, have you ever filed to deactivate this field? Not sold it, not leased it, not let the registration lapse, but actually filed a notice that you were closing it?" I said no, never, not once in 31 years, and I could show her every renewal I'd ever submitted. She nodded slowly and said that was strange, because when she'd pulled the development submittals to cross-check her boundary work, the aeronautical section of the file described Hale Field as a facility on its way out of service. I drove to the county planning office the next morning with everything in a single accordion folder, and I asked for whoever was handling the Silver Pines expansion. That's how I met Evan Sloan, a planner in his early 30s with a standing desk, 3 monitors, and the wary look of a man who had been yelled at by neighbors many times. He was polite and completely unenthusiastic. He told me before I sat down that his office couldn't referee disputes between property owners and associations, and that if I had an issue with the homeowners association, I probably needed a lawyer, not a planner. I told him I hadn't come about the association. I told him I'd come because I thought his own file had bad information in it, and that if I was right, he had a problem that was bigger than mine. He stopped talking around the 4th document. He pulled up the permit file on his center monitor and started clicking, and I watched his face change from courtesy to concentration to something closer to alarm. He read for probably 6 minutes without saying a word to me. Then he turned the monitor slightly, not quite enough for me to read it, and asked me to confirm something. He asked whether I had ever provided any statement, letter, or acknowledgement to the developer or the association regarding the future operational status of Hale Field. I said no, in writing or otherwise, and I'd sign an affidavit to that effect that afternoon. Because there was a document in his file, and it wasn't a forgery, which is exactly what made it so dangerous. It was a project narrative submitted with the expansion application, and inside it, under the section addressing surrounding land uses, was a sentence stating that the adjacent private airstrip was no longer in regular operation and was anticipated to be discontinued. That sentence was the load-bearing wall of the entire approval. If the strip was winding down, the surrounding land was just pasture waiting for houses, and the whole aeronautical question could be treated as a footnote. If the strip was active and registered, then that ground had recorded restrictions on it, and the application needed a review it had never received. Evan turned to the signature page, and I already knew whose name would be there because I'd watched her sign things all year with a fountain pen she liked people to notice. Dana Whitlock, over a certification line, on behalf of the association as an adjoining stakeholder, attesting that the statements in the narrative were true and accurate to the best of her knowledge. She hadn't faked my signature. That's what I keep coming back to, because forgery would have been a cleaner sin, a single crime with a single victim. What she'd actually done was certify the operational status of a federally registered aviation facility she did not own, had no authority over, and had been told her face was active, and she'd signed her own name to it. I asked Evan the only question that mattered. I asked what would have happened if the file had said the airfield was active. He was careful, and I respected that, because a planner who speculates on the record is a planner who gets deposed. He said that if the surrounding parcels carried recorded aviation restrictions and the adjacent facility was in active service, then certain structures in certain locations would likely have required an aeronautical review and possibly a determination from the federal side before any building permit issued in that envelope. He said the word likely 3 times. Then he said he was going to need to pull the complete submittal history, and he asked me to leave everything I'd brought. Dana learned I'd been to the county within about 72 hours, which told me something about who she was talking to inside that building. She came out alone this time, no board members, no clipboard, and she found me on a ladder cleaning bugs off a leading edge. She said she'd heard I'd been wasting government time. She said the county had already ruled, that the permits were valid, that all I was doing was generating paperwork nobody would read, and that a smart man would take the offer while there was still an offer on the table, because in 6 months the whole neighborhood would be against me, and the number would be lower. Then she said a smart man would understand that he'd already lost and just hadn't been told yet. I came down the ladder because I wanted to say it to her face and not from above her, and I said, a smart woman would read what she signs. She didn't have an answer. I watched her look for one, watched her mouth start and stop, and for the first time in 14 months of letters and meetings and fines, Dana Whitlock was not smiling at me. She got in her SUV and left without another word, and that was the moment I knew she'd remembered the narrative, remembered the certification line, and understood exactly which page I'd found. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was under a wing with a torque wrench in my hand. A man's voice, flat and unhurried, said he was an aviation safety inspector with the Federal Flight Standards Office, that his name was Russell Keene, that he'd received my correspondence along with an inquiry from the county, and that he intended to conduct a site visit. He asked if the following Monday at 9 worked. He asked whether the runway surface was serviceable and whether he could walk both ends. He didn't tell me I was right, didn't offer sympathy, didn't say a single word about the association, and I hung up more nervous than I'd been all year, because a man that neutral is a man who is going to find whatever is actually there. Dana's response to the news was to build faster, and I mean visibly, aggressively faster. Somebody told her an inspector was coming, and instead of pausing anything, she doubled the framing crews on the 11 closest houses. For 2 solid weeks, there were nail guns going at 6:30 in the morning and lights on generators running past 8 at night, and shells went up on lots that had been slabs in April. I understood the logic because it's an old and often effective one. She was manufacturing a completed fact. A framed and dried-in house with a family under contract is a very hard thing for any agency to touch, and she was betting that if she got far enough along, the cost of unwinding it would make everyone decide to live with it. I went to that meeting. I wasn't a member, and I had no right to speak, and I knew perfectly well she'd use me as a prop, and I went anyway, because I'd learned that when someone is telling a room about you, it's better to be a person standing at the back than a name on a page. Dana ran it beautifully, I'll give her that. She had a projector, she had a rendering of the finished boulevard, she had a chart of comparable home values, and she had a room of tired people who had put their savings into those houses and were frightened. When she got to me, she didn't even use my name at first. She said the community was being held up by one man's private pastime, and that the needs of hundreds of homeowners had to weigh more than the pleasure of one. First question: who certified to the county that Hale Field was no longer in regular operation and would be discontinued, given that I am the owner and I have never filed anything of the kind? Second question: Has any aeronautical review been performed for the structures now standing within the approach areas at either end of that runway? Third question. Why does the recorded aviation easement, which has existed on the land under the new homes since 1988, not appear anywhere on the site plan the association has been presenting to this room? Then I said thank you, and I sat down, and I didn't say another word for the rest of the night. She answered none of them. She said the projects were fully permitted, which wasn't an answer to any of the three. She said the county had approved everything, which was the same non-answer in a different jacket. She said my questions were an attempt to intimidate homeowners, and then she moved to adjourn, and I watched a very specific thing happen in that room. It got quiet in the way a room gets quiet when people who trusted somebody hear a question they suddenly want the answer to. A woman near the front wrote something down. Ellis, the retired mail carrier, turned all the way around in his chair and looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked back at Dana. Nolan Pierce caught me in the gravel lot afterward, standing between two trucks where the light didn't reach. He was the general contractor on the expansion, mid-40s, sunburned neck, forearms like cable, a man who built things for a living and had no appetite whatsoever for lawyers. He asked if we could talk without it becoming anything. Then he told me that when his company took the job, the plans they were handed marked the adjacent airstrip as inactive, in writing on the drawings, and that his site superintendent had raised the airplane question early because he'd watched me fly over the pad and thought it was strange. Nobody had said anything about it. He said he'd been told the airport status was handled at the ownership level and wasn't his scope. The next morning Dana escalated one more time, and this was the move that finished her, though neither of us knew it yet. A crew showed up and built a 6-foot cedar privacy fence with masonry columns across the shoulder of the county easement near my main gate, angled in a way that made turning a fuel trailer into my property nearly impossible. She sent a notice describing it as a community safety measure to control unauthorized traffic. I stood there for a while and let myself want to take a chainsaw to it, and then I didn't. I got my camera, shot it from 9 angles with a scale rod, logged the coordinates, pulled the county right-of-way plat, and sent the whole package to Evan Sloan and to Russell Keene with one sentence. This was constructed yesterday. Monday morning at 8:51, a plain gray sedan with a federal plate came through my gate, and my hands were not steady. Russell Keene was about 58, gray at the temples, khakis and a windbreaker, and he carried a scuffed canvas bag and a clipboard with a metal cover. He shook my hand for exactly as long as politeness required. He didn't compliment my hangar or my airplane. He asked me to confirm my identity, asked for the facility identifier out loud, and then asked whether the runway was currently in use, whether I had flown it that week, and whether there was any active construction on my own property. Then he pulled out a map, unfolded it on the hood of his car, and started making small marks with a mechanical pencil. Dana's SUV came through the gate about 4 minutes later, which meant somebody had called her the second his plate appeared. She got out fast, walked straight past me, extended her hand, and introduced herself as the president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, and she started talking before he'd finished shaking. She said she was glad he'd come, that there had been a great deal of confusion, that Hale Field was an obsolete personal airstrip that hadn't been meaningfully used in years, and that the association had worked closely with the county to ensure everything was properly approved. She said the word obsolete twice. Russell listened to all of it without changing his expression once, and then he asked her to hold that thought. He turned to me and asked, "Mr. Hale, is this facility closed?" I said, "No, sir, it is not, and it never has been." He asked whether I had ever submitted a notice of deactivation or a change of status, and I said no. He asked whether I had authorized any party to represent my facility's status to a permitting authority, and I said no. He wrote each answer down. Then he opened a folder, read for maybe 40 seconds, and looked up at Dana with an expression that had nothing in it at all, and asked her a 9-word question. So who told the project that it was closed? She reached for the county immediately, the way she always did. She said the county had reviewed and approved every element of the expansion, that permits had been issued, that inspections had passed, and that if there was a defect in the process, it was a county matter and not the association's. Russell let her finish. Then he explained, in the calmest voice I have ever heard from a man delivering bad news, that a local building permit is not a substitute for an aeronautical review where one is required, that the two processes answer different questions, and that a permit issued on the basis of inaccurate information about a surrounding facility is a permit with a problem in its foundation. He said the county would need to sort out its own file. He said his interest was the airspace. Then he walked, and Dana and I both followed like two people who had somehow enrolled in the same class. He walked the entire 3,100 feet of pavement, then off the south end into the graded lots. He measured the distance from my displaced threshold to the nearest foundation with a laser. He shot the ridge height of the closest 2-story shell, and then the one behind it, and then the ornamental light standards, and he wrote a number next to each. He noted the masonry perimeter wall, its length and height. He noted the double row of oaks and asked me one question about them, which was how tall that species gets around here, and when I said 50 to 60 feet, he underlined something twice. Dana tried, finally, and it came out badly. She said she'd been told it wasn't necessary, and Russell asked by whom, and she said the development partnership's consultants, and he asked for the name of the consultant and the date, and she didn't have either. Then she said, and I think she genuinely believed this was a strong point, that Hale Field was only a private airstrip. Russell put his pencil in his shirt pocket and told her that private use describes who may land there, not whether it exists, that the facility was registered with published coordinates and a recorded easement across the very ground she'd developed, and that no one gets to assume a landing facility away because assuming is cheaper than checking. She looked at me then. I want to be honest about this moment, because it's the one I think about. She looked at me the way people look at someone they expect to bail them out, with something like appeal in her face, as if 14 months of letters and fines and that word obsolete had been a professional disagreement between colleagues, and now was the time for me to step in and smooth it over. I didn't say anything, not one word. I'd said everything I had to say to her in a parking lot, in a clubhouse, and in a folder on Evan Sloan's desk, and there was nothing left that needed my voice. Russell Keene left at 11:40, and the last thing he did was ask the county to produce the complete Silver Pines submittal history, every revision, every narrative, every certification, with dates. He said it to Evan on speakerphone from my gravel driveway. Then he told me he'd be in touch, told Dana that she should preserve all project communications, got in his gray sedan, and drove out. Dana stood in my driveway for a full minute after he was gone, and then she said, without any heat in it at all, that I had no idea what I'd started. She was right about that. I didn't. What I knew was that I hadn't started it. What they found was simple enough to say in 3 sentences, which is why it was so devastating. The approvals for the expansion's northern phase had been evaluated on the basis of a narrative, stating that the adjacent airfield was no longer in regular operation and was anticipated to be discontinued. There was no filing anywhere, at any level, deactivating Hale Field. There was no application from me, no change of status approval, no lapse in registration, no correspondence, no nothing across 31 continuous years. And the aviation easement restricting height and use on the developed parcels had been recorded in 1988, 22 years before the partnership bought its first acre out here. The orders went out in a single package, a stop work order on all incomplete structures within the affected envelope at both approach ends. A hold placed on certificates of occupancy for every unit in the northern phase that had not yet been transferred, which meant 4 families under contract could not close. A requirement that all structures within the recorded easement area be re-evaluated for compliance with the height and use restrictions. A separate review of the ornamental light standards, the masonry perimeter wall, and the tree planting plan as potential obstructions. And a directive that no further permits issue in that phase until a proper aeronautical review was completed and submitted. Nolan Pierce pulled his crews the same afternoon he got the order. I watched it from my fence, and it was the strangest thing I've ever seen from that spot. 40 men and 11 pieces of equipment simply stopped, and by 4 o'clock the site was silent, and the framed shells stood there with their house wrap flapping and nobody in them. Dana came to my property that evening, on foot, which she'd never once done, and she stood at my gate and told me I had done this, that I had destroyed $100 million of community investment out of pride, that people were going to lose money because a man couldn't accept that time had moved past him. I said no. I said I didn't do this, Dana. I said I never filed a thing, never moved a stake, never poured a slab, never signed a narrative. All I did was refuse to sign my name to your lie, and everything after that was other people reading documents that existed before you got here. She said I could have taken the offer. I said she could have made a phone call to the owner of a registered airfield before certifying its status to a government agency, and it would have cost her nothing but 4 minutes and the ability to keep believing I was somebody she could step over. Russell Keene's final piece of the record arrived a week later, and it took away the last defense anyone had. Hale Field didn't merely exist in current aeronautical records. It had been in published aeronautical documentation continuously for decades, appearing with its identifier, coordinates, runway orientation, and dimensions in materials any consultant on any land development project involving airspace would obtain as a matter of routine. It was on charts, it was on the plat, it was in a recorded easement chained to the deed of every lot in that phase. There was no version of reality in which a professional could credibly claim not to have known, and once that was on paper, the developer's lawyers stopped arguing about whether and started arguing about who pays. Her instinct when the orders hit was the one I expected, which was to put the residents between herself and the consequences. She sent a long email to all of Silver Pines, saying that because an adjoining owner had refused to cooperate, tens of millions of dollars in property value were now at risk, that 4 families' closings had been blocked, and that the association would pursue every avenue to protect its members. It was well written. It named me twice. And it landed on a community that had just spent 11 weeks watching a federal inspector walk a runway that the association's own site plan said was a hay field, and this time it did not work at all. The special meeting on the 22nd was the loudest room I have ever stood in, and almost none of the noise was aimed at me. A woman named Charlotte Reyes, who had bought in Phase 1 4 years earlier, stood up with a printed page in her hand and asked why no disclosure in her closing package mentioned an active airport 400 yards from her back door. A man asked whether the easement recorded against his lot in 1988 had been disclosed to him, and when nobody could answer, he asked it again, louder. And then a soft-spoken guy near the window asked the question that ended Dana's presidency, which was simply, who signed the paper saying the airport was closing. Her reply was 1 sentence long, and it was the most expensive sentence of her life. Owner will eventually have no practical choice but to close it. That's what she wrote. Not it's closed. Not I've confirmed with the owner. Owner will eventually have no practical choice, which is a sentence that can only be written by a person who knows, at the moment of writing, that the facility is open and operating and that the plan is to make it unusable. She'd written it from her association email account in the ordinary course of her duties as president, to the general contractor of the project. She passed me in the clubhouse parking lot after that emergency session, and she couldn't help herself. She asked, with real venom, whether I was enjoying tearing up an entire neighborhood, and I gave her the only answer I had, which was the truth. I said, "I didn't put those houses there, Dana. You did. You put them under a runway that was on the plat, in the records, and in the easement chained to the deed of every lot you sold, and then you signed a page saying the runway was going away because you'd decided I was the kind of man who'd let you." She got in her car. She didn't slam the door, which surprised me. The technical review took 4 more months, and the outcome was not the movie version. Nobody bulldozed a neighborhood. 51 of the 62 homes in that phase were fine, and they got built, sold, and lived in because they were far enough out and low enough that the airspace was never the issue. Reasonableness is what actually happens when documents win, and reasonableness is boring. But 11 of those structures sat in a position that no amount of redesign could fix, because you cannot lower a 2-story house out of a departure path, and you cannot move a foundation 11 degrees to the left. Those 11 had never been occupied, which mattered enormously. So this is what happened to them. 6 houses that were framed but not dried in were disassembled, and the salvageable lumber was hauled off in 10 days. 5 that were farther along were demolished to the slab, and the slabs were broken out over the following month. The 4 purchase contracts were unwound, and the deposits refunded with the developer eating the difference on relocations. The closest lots were replatted as permanent open space and dedicated as such, with the restriction recorded so that nobody 20 years from now could try the same thing again. And the double row of oaks and cypress in the approach corridor came out root ball and all. The developer absorbed the bulk of the redesign and demolition cost because their consultants had relied on a narrative they'd had every professional obligation to verify. The association had to formally withdraw every demand relating to the closure of Hale Field, in writing, on letterhead, and that document is framed in my hangar next to my father's grease pencil tool board. Every fine they'd ever assessed against me was voided, all $4,100 of it, with an acknowledgement that my property had never been subject to their declaration and never could be without my consent, and the noise restriction requests, the hangar color demands, the architectural committee summons, all of it evaporated the way things do when someone finally checks whether they were ever real. Then the board found the money. In 14 months, the association had spent $138,000 in legal and consulting fees pursuing a landowner outside its jurisdiction, on the theory that association authority could reach a property that had never been inside it. Not one attorney had ever put that theory in writing, because no attorney would. That number went into a member packet, line by line, with dates, and it did more damage in that community than anything the federal inspector ever said. Because homeowners will forgive a mistake, and they will forgive a delay, but they do not forgive finding out their dues paid for a fight they were never told they were in. The vote came on a Thursday in November, in the same clubhouse, in the same folding chairs. It took 11 minutes. Dana Whitlock was removed as president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association by a margin I won't repeat because it would sound like gloating, and I don't need to gloat. There were no handcuffs. Nobody shouted. No police lights, no perp walk, no dramatic collapse. She sat at the far end of the same long table where she had spent 2 years deciding who got to speak and for how long, and she raised her hand to be recognized, and the new chair looked past her to somebody else. The land looks different now, and I still notice it every time I taxi. Where 6 shells and 5 slabs used to stand, there's a 190-yard band of open ground, mowed twice a year, with a low split-rail fence and a recorded dedication that will outlive everyone involved. The oaks are gone from the corridor and replanted along the interior streets where they'll do somebody some good. The boulevard lights are shorter, and, I'll admit it, they look better. And the runway is exactly where my father cut it in 1969, 3,100 feet of patched asphalt, pointing north into nothing but air. Nolan Pierce came out in the spring with a case of good beer and an apology I hadn't asked for. He said he should have stopped and made a phone call the day his superintendent raised the question, and that he'd let somebody else's certification do his thinking for him. I told him that was more accountability than I'd gotten from anyone with a title, and we sat on my tailgate for an hour talking about foundations and crosswinds. He's built 3 houses in the county since, and he tells me he pulls the aeronautical records now as a matter of routine, even when nobody makes him. Ellis brings his grandson back to the fence on Saturdays. Dana sold her house 8 months after the vote. I heard she moved about 2 hours south, and I heard she's doing something in commercial leasing, and I hope she's all right, because I've never needed her ruined to feel finished. The last time I saw her, she slowed down at my gate in a car I didn't recognize. No association SUV. No magnetic sign on the door, no title under her name, no clipboard. She sat there with the window down, looking past me at the strip and the open ground where the 11 houses used to be, and she said 4 words. "You won, didn't you?" I shook my head because it wasn't true and I wasn't going to let it be the last thing said out there. I told her I never needed to beat her. I said all I ever needed was for her to stop deciding which parts of my life belonged to her, and that if she had knocked on my hangar door 2 years ago and asked one honest question about the airfield, she'd still be president, and there would be 62 houses out there instead of 51. She looked at the open ground for another second. Then she put the window up and drove off, and I stood at my gate for a while and then went back to work. That afternoon I rolled the hangar door open, pulled the airplane out onto the ramp, and did my walk-around slower than I needed to. I drained the sumps, checked the oil, ran my hand along the leading edge my father had patched in 1984. The windsock was standing about 8 knots out of the north, which meant a departure straight down the strip. Months earlier, standing on this gravel, Dana had told me her houses would leave me nowhere left to fly, and I'd said nothing because there was nothing worth saying to a woman that's certain. I ran the engine up, held the brakes, checked the mags, and released. 3,100 feet of my father's asphalt went under me, and the wheels came off the ground somewhere around the 1,800-foot mark, like they always do on a cool day. I climbed out over the south end and put a shallow bank in so I could look down at Silver Pines, at the neat streets, and the shorter lights, and the 51 roofs, and then at the wide band of open grass where the framing used to be. Nothing under my nose. Nothing in the corridor. Nothing at all in front of my runway for the first time since the day she rolled that window down.